We are living in unprecedented times, not just because of the pandemic, but also because we have seen the ugly head of racism rise in our nation. Truly, it is America's constant curse. But we have reason to hope. Young, peaceful protesters all around the world are teaching us that it is not just enough to not be a racist. This generation is teaching us that we must engage in anti-racist behaviors and practices. This series on anti-racism is designed to encourage a national dialogue on how we engage in anti-racist behaviors and practices when focusing on our teaching, our research, and our outreach to schools, communities, businesses, and industries. We will explore and discuss how we do so in a way that respects the communities we have the privilege of working with each and every day. It's prompted by the belief that Black and Brown lives matter as much as anyone else's life. Being anti-racist is fighting against racism, drawing directly from the Smithsonian Institute's website on anti-racism. Racism takes several forms and works most often with at least one other form to reinforce racist ideas, behavior, and policy. There are 4 types of racism: individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Individual racism refers to the beliefs and actions of individuals that support or perpetuates racism in conscious and unconscious ways. The US cultural narrative about racism typically focuses on individual racism and fails to recognize systemic racism. Examples of individual racism include believing in the superiority of white people or telling a racist joke. The second form of racism is interpersonal racism, which occurs between individuals. These are public expressions of racism, often involving slurs, biases, or hateful words or actions. The third form of racism is institutional racism, which occurs in an organization. These are discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices that result in inequitable outcomes for whites over people of color and extend considerably beyond prejudice. These institutional policies often never mention any racial group, but the intent is to create advantages. An example of institutional racism occurs in the public school system, in which most students are non-white, but are taught by mostly white teachers who are not all anti-racist. On the other hand, rich neighborhoods are more likely to have better teachers, less students and teachers of color, and more money for education. The fourth form of racism is structural racism. Structural racism is the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society. These systems give privileges to white people, resulting in disadvantages to people of color. An example of structural racism is stereotyping all people of color as criminals. It is not enough to say you are not racist. You need to be anti-racist. In the words of author Ibram Kendi, being anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. Being anti-racist results from a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. These choices require ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon session on anti-racism.
Thank you, Dean Middleton, for your commitment to anti-racism and making room for this space. Good afternoon, good people. My name is Dr. Theda Gibbs Gray, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Ohio University. Today's forum, through which we honor Black women's academic and professional experiences, represents the fourth of a six-part series on anti-racism, sponsored by the Ohio University Patton College of Education. Previous sessions can be found on the Patton College YouTube channel. Today's event is being recorded, and a recording of this session will be posted on the Patton College YouTube channel. We invite you to place any questions you may have for the panelists in the chat room, and we'll get to as many questions as time permits. Yet, due to the limited time we have together today, we will likely not get to all of your questions. Also, at the end of the session, an evaluation will be placed in the Q&A, and we encourage you to take a few minutes when the event concludes to provide us with useful feedback about your experience. As we transition, I would also like to thank Dr. Mona Robinson, Professor of Counselor Education, who is our convener and has been an integral part of organizing today's space. Today, we are honored to be graced with 4 Black women scholars participating in our forum today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adrian Irby, who holds a PhD in counseling with a multicultural counseling cognate from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She also holds an MS in community counseling from Oklahoma State University and a BA in psychology from Oral Roberts University. Dr. Irby teaches core master's and doctoral courses in counselor education. Her research focuses on multicultural and social justice issues in counseling and counselor education, including racial, cultural, and LGBTQ issues, intersectionality, identity development, and educational practices fostering cultural competence. Dr. Jean Christie Thomas Harris spent 37 years as a professional educator. She retired from Columbus City Schools in 2013. She earned her undergraduate degree in English from the University of Notre Dame and her master's degree and PhD in education from the Ohio State University and Ohio University, respectively. Dr. Harris served as classroom teacher, high school principal, supervisor of principals, assistant superintendent, deputy superintendent, superintendent of schools, and state assistant superintendent. For 36 years, Dr. Harris has been a disciple at Mount Olivet Baptist Church, where she serves as high school Sunday school teacher, Christ-centered discipleship facilitator, member of the choir, tutor in the after-school program, and vice chair of the Ministry of Trustees. She is married to Stanley E. Harris, a retired career banker. Together, they have one son, Wade Thomas Harris, wife Belinda, and 3 precocious grandchildren, Nathan, Noah, and Naomi. Dr. Ada Ward Randolph is a professor of educational research and evaluation at Ohio University in the Patton College of Education, where she specializes in qualitative methodology, cultural studies, and the history of education. She received her PhD from the Ohio State University in educational policy and leadership, with specializations in African American and women's education history, urban education policy, race, class, and gender studies, curriculum, and qualitative methodology. Her research has focused on African American teachers and principals in urban communities. Dr. Randolph has published in many journals, including Qualitative Inquiry, Urban Education, Educational Studies, Journal of School Leadership, and History of Education Quarterly. Since 1986, Dr. Randolph has conducted anti-racist workshops as a member of Women Against Racism at the University of Iowa. Dr. Randolph is a member of many professional organizations and has served in many leadership roles, including the presidency of the History of Education Society. Nicole Antoinette Smith is a social entrepreneur, author, speaker, consultant, and full-time assistant professor of instruction at Ohio University in the College of Business, and a part-time instructor at the University of the Virgin Islands online. When not lecturing, Nicole Antoinette provides management consulting services under her company, Nicole Antoinette Consulting, using 7 proprietary business methodologies, including her trademark data strategy methodology, data phenomics. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Nicole launched 2 pilot programs to train and staff ready-to-work adult learners in a high-3, high-skill, high-wage, high-demand career. Before we begin, we first honor our Black woman ancestral roots, whose love and resistance have allowed for us to be in this space. As Black women, such spaces as today's are not always available in greater society, where we can offer our stories on our own terms, and for this, we are thankful. This panel also maintains significance beyond us and extends to each of us at Ohio University and the broader community. Communities that we exist in, including at Ohio University, can only truly thrive when all parts of the whole, including Black women, thrive. Listening to, understanding, and affirming Black women's experiences impact how we build community for our Black women colleagues and Black women students in our classrooms. It also matters in the classroom spaces where Black women are not present, reminding us of our responsibility to dismantle the structures that prevent their presence, and our responsibility to ensure their stories are told in the curriculum we teach. We will now begin our rich discussion with our panelists by further grounding the significance of our space today. Our first question is, why is it necessary for Black women's stories to be told and shared? Each of our panelists will respond, and we will begin with Dr. Harris.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate everyone being here today because obviously this topic is an important topic for you, or at least you're curious, and that's good. And in answer to the question, frankly, I believe the reason it is important for the stories of Black women to be told and shared is because the real stories are largely unknown. You see, our story in the United States, as many of you know, started in 1619 when our ancestors came over on the slave ships and had to decide whether they should murder their children by drowning or allow them to be victim of the horrors that lie ahead. And obviously those of us are on this panel are the descendants of women who chose life for their children. Then while in slavery, the Black women had to watch as their husbands were sold away and had to work to protect their young boys so they didn't face the same fate. We raised children that were produced through sexual assault, and then after slavery and through Jim Crow, and even in some circumstances today, we raised other people's children while sacrificing our own and in order to survive. And today, while Black women, you might be surprised to know, are identified as some of the best educated people on the planet by the National Center of Education Statistics, we still make less money than our white counterparts. And even in high wage fields like medicine and engineering, despite our education and progress, we are still viewed by many as welfare queens, and our beauty even is suspect to some, with prominent Black women in recent years being called men, monsters, and nasty. Even in the workplace, often we don't feel valued and our voices are not heard. We are expected to maintain our cool in spite of it all, be civil, and work hard. And I think you'll hear examples of some of these things that I've said today. So I just think it's really important for us to open our hearts and minds to the stories of Black women who have so much to give and have given so much and are giving so much, but in so many areas are disrespected.
Thank you for that powerful response, Jean. We will now hear from Adrian, Ada, and Nicole.
When I start thinking about why we center Black women's voices, for me, it's because our voices and our perspectives have truly been, and it offers an opportunity to illuminate racialized gender experiences within America. We have been able to speak to issues beyond just our own, but we're able to speak to gender, we're able to speak to race, we're able to speak to social class. Our voices have been centered in moving forward movements that weren't even about us. And that to me is the gift of Black women, is that we are for everyone. And I think that that's so important when we start talking about centering our voices. And I think that that really ties into kind of the whole point of this conversation, is how are we centering our perspective so that we can illuminate equity for everyone. Thank you so much.
Why do we need to understand the lives of African American women? And a second part of that is the fact that we are African and American, that our story beginning in 1619 is the American story. So without centering, is the term my friend Adrian brings, then we're leaving out a lot of our own history, of our own understanding of the American experience. And it's definitely gendered, and it's definitely shaped by our race, our class, our gender. But it's a story that Phyllis Wheatley tried to tell when she wrote her poetry, and Mariah Stewart tried to tell when she was the first woman, Black woman, to speak in public, to now with the works of Senator Kamala Harris. So our stories are central to the American story, and they're warranted, and they need to be told, and most of all, read and understood.
Mm-hmm.
Ada, thank you for that. One of the things you mentioned was that we need to be recognized as American and African at the same time. What I have before you, in order to answer that question, I think it's best to answer it with a poem. And the poem originally was called, titled, How Do I Unpack 50 Years of Being an African American Woman in America? But now that I heard your response to that, what I like to do is rename it. How do I unpack 50 years of being Black, an African American woman? That is how. For days, I've wanted to use a pen to get to the core of how I'm feeling. I've avoided the pen, but here I go with the contents of me. How do I unpack 50 years of built up anger, assumptions, fear, mistreatment, judgment, stress, frustration, missed opportunities, letdowns, rejections, disappointments, and lies? How do I unpack 50 years of stares that linger too long, scraps instead of the best portion, unwanted handshakes, no invitations, whispers of secret plans, heads bowed or ducking out of avoidance, questions that shouldn't be asked, deflection, an immediate fear when looking through the rearview mirror, wondering if the lights will come on. Changing my driving plans to avoid the men and women in blue. Assessing if an exit is safe to stop when on a road trip, and the turning of heads the other way when saying hello. How do I unpack 50 years of an empty seat next to me? Lunches alone, wondering if my skin tone will be rejected by students and colleagues. Hoping someone who looks like me would be hired. Looking at profiles and able to count on one hand who resembles me. Voice silenced, ideas ignored, and the requirement to always perform head and shoulder above my counterparts. How do I unpack 50 years of being told no with no reason? Doors closed, higher rates, subpar services, cuts in lines, entitlement to the space occupied by me, and visions of unwarranted attacks. Perhaps I'm not supposed to unpack, because where would I put the contents of me?
Nicole, thank you so much for that amazing, beautiful, and powerful poem. What each of you have done in responding, Nicole, Adrian, Ada, and Jean, is to remind us that Black women have rich stories to tell, and we tell them in multiple and beautiful ways. We tell our stories through prose, through poetry, through engaging in rich conversations like we're starting today. So thank you each for your responses. We will now transition to our second question. What must the Ohio University and broader community understand about who you are and your experiences as they relate to your identity as a Black woman educator? We will begin by hearing from Adrian, followed by Ada, and then Jean.
So when I start thinking about this question, I really have to start way, way back. And this starts for me at Black girlhood. What are the experiences that we have from our homes, where we are valued, where we're loved, we're seen as beautiful, we are prized, and then we walk outside and we get that very quickly. Those things don't hold in those same environments. And it's not just outside in the universe, but it's outside in education, in these classrooms, with our colleagues as students, with our peers, with our faculty, with our administrators, with school resource officers, school counselors. It starts so early. We are attached to our past. And I think what I frequently hear whenever we start talking about issues of diversity, inclusion, equity along racial gender lines is that our experiences are, what can we do for our school? What can we do for our community? We have to recognize that our schools, our communities are steeped in a history, and that the interactions that we are having with individuals that look like us and that don't look like us are steeped in history. And so when I'm responding, when I am experiencing racism and sexism, it's not just that I'm experiencing it from you today. It's that I'm experiencing it from you and yours over years and years of history. And that longevity, that's felt in our bones, that's felt in our genes, that's felt in our minds, that's felt in our psyche. We can't talk about what's happening today without talking about what's happened in the past. And so pulling all of that together, we can talk about how from girlhood through our elementary school, through high school, through college, through graduate school, through our professional experiences to higher education, all those leadership roles, all those student roles, all those colleague roles. It's the same story. And I want it to be a different story. I want it to be the story of home where we were valued and our voice had power. And yet we show up in these spaces with all the accolades, all the letters behind our names, all the certifications and licenses, and yet still, no. And I think that when we start talking about what can Ohio University do, what can our school do, it's really about looking at that history and bringing that to the present.
I'm not sure who was supposed to go next, but I'd really like to jump in if I could and follow up on what Adrian said. It is true. You know, we come from our communities with all of the confidence and the belief that we can conquer the world. Yet, when we get out into the world, it's as if we have to prove ourselves every single day with every single decision. And it doesn't seem as though, at least from my perspective, from my 37 years in education as a professional and my 67 years on this earth, it doesn't seem as though there are others that have to do that same thing. You know, our beauty is questioned, our competence is questioned, you know, all those things are questioned and have to be reproved every day. And it's really, sometimes it gets to be a really heavy burden, especially since all we're trying to do is make the world better for everybody. Certainly we have a focus on our children and people that look like us, but we're not an exclusive people. We nurture and we build up and we educate everyone, but yet we have to reprove and reprove every day that we are worthy to stay in the position that we have.
Yes, thank you, Jean, for that, because it ties right perfectly into what I am thinking about. I came up with a saying, actually. For me, it would always be proof, not possibility. So when people see me, even though I hold 5 degrees from 2 Big Ten institutions, it will always be proof, never just a possibility of. And that onslaught that happens day after day after day after Adrian has shared. So we're tired. On one hand, you need to understand that we're tired. And that on the other hand, we want you to understand that historical as well as contemporary experiences of us as Black women. You should look at me and see the possibility that my father told me I'm a ward, I could do anything I want to do. Well, that's constantly been questioned as I left my family home. Even now as a full professor, that's questioned. What do I have positional power as a full professor, or am I still just another Black woman who is an affirmative action hire that still has to prove that she belongs here? And I go back to my family. I belong wherever I am. It's never a proof. It is the possibility that I am there. So I've earned the right, and so many of us have earned through the credentialing process that we are here. And so you need to accept when you walk into the room and you see me, that you have a Black woman professor, and that I am bound by my cultural, historical, as well as contemporary lived experiences.
Thank you each. Jean?
Theda, could I and just to follow up just briefly on what Ada said, we're tired, but we refuse to give up. I mean, even with the burdens that we know come with being an African American woman in these United States, we are exhausted, but we will not give up.
And Theda, just to follow up on that, we may be tired, but we're never hopeless. That's where our faith comes in. I am a faith-based person. And without that faith base, I don't know if I would make it. But even though things happen and they become as part of my psychic feelings, I am still hopeful and know that this too shall pass, that I have a contribution to make, and I am going to make it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you each again for your candor and for our vulnerability, because what many people may not realize is that all spaces that we're in are not always safe to share what we're sharing, but that we are creating this space and have been allowed to be in this space to say what you each have said. Part of that has been laying historical groundwork for our experiences. That leads into our next question, which is question 3. So before I ask this, I want to make sure that I ground it a bit more. As Ada, as Jean, as Nicole and Adrian have said, we have always been a valuable part of society, historically and contemporarily, though we have been made invisible in many spaces and in many instances. Recently, over the past year and the past several years, with the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a very important movement, more issues of brutality and racism have come to the forefront, and we see them in the media more. And yes, indeed, it is time for us to respond to those events. However, we want to be clear that these events have long been happening since we have existed. They predate hundreds and hundreds of years before today. And many of these instances and acts of racism do not make it to archives, as historian Dr. Bayina Jeffries reminds us. So we want to be clear that in asking this question, we're not only asking about the recent events, the recent violent attacks against Black bodies that have happened, but we're also grounding them in the violent attacks that have long been occurring within our lives and in our communities. So question 3 is, how have the public acts of racism, such as the killing of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, among countless others, how have they impacted you as a mother, wife, woman, professional, and educator? And we will begin with Ada.
Well, this could probably take the rest of the time because you gave me all those parameters. But in thinking about Mr. George Floyd's public lynching, let's get it straight. I'm a historian. It was a public lynching, and it was an African-American girl who had the bravery to actually tape it, to stand there with her phone and tape it. So when I first saw that, I just remember the callousness, the casualness that the officer, order of the court, someone of the court who had power. So this is where when Dr. Middleton was talking about different kinds of institutional power, he had individual, he used institutional power to take the freedom from this person. So George Floyd was not seen as human, but it was definitely a public lynching with his hand in his pocket. That's what I keep drawing on from that. We all saw it. People have marched about it. Black Lives Matter is a movement, but it is not a movement that began in nothing. It began from the beginning when the first slaves jumped off the ship to the ones who came and persevered. It is a continuation of the ebb and flow of the African-American experience. When I think about Breonna Taylor, she's a woman, but yet she's not getting the acclaim, of course, and I'm an African-American woman, of Mr. Floyd. But what it spoke to for me personally is I'm a mother of African-American children, males, all males, and that I'm a Black professional. And her murder was silent. And oftentimes, as an academician, instances of institutional and individual racism for us are silent. And so they go unchallenged, and they just continue to fester, and they could eat away at us, but they don't, because we are always constantly seeking our freedom and the freedom of others. So it just reminds me that freedom is a constant struggle, which is actually the title also of Angela Davis's new book. And that even though I was floored, yelled, screamed for both of these incidences, I know that it's just a continuation, that I must stay vigilant to fight against racism.
Thank you, Ada. And now we'll transition to hear more from Nicole.
Ada, you amaze me. Thank you so much. I wasn't going to respond to this question, but it hit home, and I'm going to respond from a mother's perspective. My son graduated from University of Southern California with a film and TV production degree. That's the #1 film program in the world. Here I am in Athens, Ohio, and he decided that he wanted to go to the protests. And I said, you know, I let him know, I say, why are you going? Make sure you go for a reason. That, what are you going for? Mm-hmm. And he ended up going, which was great. A couple of weeks later, something happened with my son, and I had to make the decision as a mother, a son living in Los Angeles, he's 6'5". I had to make the decision whether or not I was going to call 911. And it tore me up to pieces. As a mother, I should not have to fear that much by calling 911 for someone to help my child. I made a decision to call 911 and they said, we're going to go by there. But it was the hardest decision. And when I say I cried like a baby that night, it's a 3-hour difference. I should not have to do this. Here I am, educated. My son is clearly educated. Yet and still, I have to fear for my son's life. And I remember that day clearly. I even the numbers, and then just trying to even call 911 and finally getting someone online. And I begged the police officer, if you go over there, please don't kill my child. Could you imagine? Please, I literally begged the police officer, don't kill my child. And then I even tried to call it off. I said, no, that's okay. That's okay. Don't go. And he said, ma'am, we're not going to kill your child. And I begged them over and over. I was on my hands and knees begging them, just crying into the phone not to kill my child. Needless to say, they didn't. But the fear, I should not have to go through that. No mother, no wife, no sister, no brother, no one should have to go through that in America, or period, in the world. Thank you for allowing me to respond.
Nicole, I just thank you for your transparency. You've helped me today, and I can't imagine that you've helped a lot of people out there by sharing your heart. And I just want to follow up to say that I think many people don't understand that every time we see in 2020 and the few years before these public lynchings, it has a psychological effect on all of us. You know, I want to, when I see these things, I want to reach out and make sure I know where my husband is. I know where my son is. I know where my grandsons are. I think about the thousands of young people that I had the privilege to work with. I want to know that they're safe. This puts me in mind, it reminds us, or it makes us think about what our people had to go through with the lynchings of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s that were just, you know, just right outside their doors. So now we're experiencing the same psychological trauma that they experienced with these, as Ada so aptly called them, these public lynchings. So I feel, I'm just going to close with this, I feel personally assaulted every time one of these incidents happen. It's not just somebody else over there. I mean, that's my cousin, my brother, my sister. It could be anybody that I know. We're just blessed that it's not, but and many times it's somebody that somebody else knows. But even if it isn't, we feel personally assaulted because we know that the next time it could be somebody in our very families. It could be us. It's a terrible way to have to live.
Thank you for that, Jean. I wanted to add in just a little bit because as I was listening, you know, I'm not a mother. And part of what I hear, though, is that, I mean, it's not as though these experiences don't impact me in similar ways. I look at my brother, I look at my father, I look at my mother, I look at all of these generations. I go to our family home in Mississippi and I see literal graves that are separated by race on our property. That these are where the white people are buried and these are where the Black people are buried. And when I think about that history, that legacy, when we talk about this as something that is just in the past or just in the, no, this is a long, long narrative. And for us to pretend like this narrative is not inside every single one of us, I think is a part of what breaks my heart, because we're all connected here. We're all connected to this story. James Baldwin talks about this. We see our artists, we see our poets, we see our writers respond to this reality. And I frequently refer to this art exhibit, Unseen, by Ken Gonzalez-Day and Titus Kaphar. And it was amazing because when they focused on these missing images, these missing stories, these missing narratives in our history, the most impactful thing that I saw was they were showing pictures of these postcards and images of lynchings, but they digitally removed the person that was being lynched, because the issue was not that person and what that person did, didn't do, was suspected of doing. I want to know, what does it take for a person to watch death, to participate in death, and sit there and take a picture to put on a postcard? That's what I want to know about. And so when we start talking about these issues, it's not my issue. I'm sitting here watching and looking at people that look just like me, look just like my brother, look just like my father. And I see white people looking at others who look just like them. And the blank face that comes up, I don't understand it. And that dichotomy of experience is a part of what we're missing. So if we want to have these conversations, then let's have these conversations and recognize the different positions that we have in these conversations. I think Ada was going to go ahead, Ada.
Okay, I'm sorry, Adrian. That was, again, so powerful, because what really struck me again about Breonna and Mr. Floyd was that I have been experiencing racism after over 20 plus years at Ohio University in the College of Education, from a white female student and a faculty, her white colleagues, her white educators. And I asked myself, what's up with this? These are supposed to be so-called social justice educators. Do they understand what's really happening here? Or is it, again, a movement or something that they're saying that they are, but they did nothing? And so that individual act of racism turned into institutional acts of racism. And I had to grapple with that, and thank God for my sisters, some on this panel, who supported me through that. And then Breonna Taylor hit, and then George Floyd hit. And I was like, okay, that's perfect indicator of this is going on in the larger world as well. And whereas my death did not occur, the pain that occurred from how racism affects us psychologically, intellectually, emotionally, physically, psychically, rendered. It lingered for a while. And I had to work through that because I understood what I was experiencing. And I wondered how a system, which I believe in, who I'm believing that people are engaged in and who are trying to be revolutionary or abolitionist, as Bettina Love says, could support this. So that's George Floyd, we all saw. Breonna Taylor, we all saw. But what happens to us as African American women in colleges of education? There's a book called Tedious Journeys, which talks about Black women. And that's not the first book. Stephanie Evans has works about this, but yet it continues. So for me, on an individual level is where I felt it, because it represented what I was feeling inside of myself, but had no place to take it.
I am left speechless. I really am, in terms of the power, the weight, the meaning, the pain, the healing, all of that is wrapped up in how complex and rich our stories are, and what we walk around with every day, that we will talk about in just a few minutes, in terms of creating healing spaces for ourselves, even beyond today. And yes, Dr. Robinson posted and made a comment about racial trauma, about the realness of racial trauma, which is tremendous, and it's hard. It's hard to even put it into words effectively. But each of you have, and I thank you for digging very deeply and honestly to share what you each have shared. What I want to ask is a spinoff of what you just responded to, and it is a question from the audience, so I don't want us to move too far from this and stay within this. How do we handle suggestions that we pretend that these things aren't happening? So that we pretend that the recent murders that have happened, how do we handle suggestions to avoid talking about it or to erase? So there are also examples of that. These murders and this racial violence should be erased from history books and should be erased from our discussions. So how do we handle these suggestions that pretend that these things are not and have never happened, that relate to our academic and professional spaces? And Adrian, if you could start us off.
Sure. So one of the things that I think of, and maybe this goes back in some ways to that mental health training, is I think of things like denial. I think of classic defense mechanisms of, if we just don't talk about this, if we just walk around it, if we just skip over it, these are things that we know are very problematic. It's problematic for us to pretend that the things happening around us are not happening. We hold it in our bodies, we hold it in our psyche. So again, we cannot ignore historical trauma, racial trauma. We can't ignore those things because we know that all of that is activated in these direct interactions. We know that that has an impact. So when we start talking about, should we skip over it? Should we just get a nice, clean, happy history? I think I wonder, do we expect the same out of people? I know I do things wrong all the time. My close friends are happy to tell me when I do things wrong. And that's a part of what we have to do, is we pretend like history or our national identity or any of those things are perfect, precious things that can't be challenged, that can't be questioned. But the only way that we grow, the only way that we improve is by looking at ourselves, is by examining who we are, how we engage in these issues. And I'm going to mention something even from Dina Simmons in terms of this idea of social emotional learning. We can't talk about all this lovely, great stuff in schools without talking about the context out of which it is born. Because as she says, if we're going to talk about social emotional learning without context, it's just white supremacy with a hug. And I'm good. I don't need that. So you can give me white supremacy hard or soft, either way. But regardless, white supremacy is not what I'm looking for here. So if we're going to eliminate the context and just pretend like these disparities are not what they are not tied back to systemic and institutional racism and sexism and every other ism that we have, then I have nothing to say. Then let's just pretend that we're all unicorns and, living in rainbow land. And I just feel like that's absurd. And so for us to be real, to be authentic, to be honest, then that's what we have to do. And it's difficult. I think no one is arguing. There's not one person on this panel who would argue that that's not a difficult process. But we have to examine ourselves and ask the question, how am I perpetuating sexism here? How am I perpetuating racism here? Did I see that just happen and say nothing? What does that mean about me? And those questions, I think, are so critical. That's really what came up for me.
Why would we ignore the truth? It makes absolutely no sense to me. We don't improve. We don't go forward. Life doesn't get better for anyone else. Now, if we want to keep the world just as it is, with the vast disparities that exist, then sure, let's just do that. But if we really want to live up to the democratic ideal on which the United States was built, allegedly, because we could argue that with looking at some of our founding documents, but the democratic ideal that I think that many of us want, then we can't ignore history. The Holocaust went on for a really long time because people were ignoring it. Oh, just ignore it. That can't be happening. And we in the United States ignored it. That just can't be happening. So to use a phrase from our young people, I'm not down with that. I think that's and I think that when people talk about that publicly, it should be put down. That whole notion should be put down, and it should be put down fast, and it should be put down hard.
Who does that serve becomes a question for me. Who does that serve to ignore 1619 Project? Right. Who does that serve to ignore the Civil War, or the fact that June 10th is founded because for several years there were African Americans who were not free, but were free by the Emancipation Proclamation, but not told that they were free? So who does it serve to ignore the truth? It serves those who are in power, who have white privilege plus power, which equals racism or any ism. For those, homophobia, I mean, all the isms are connected, and they're all about who's going to have the power, or as historians say, the booty from this raid here. We had several Holocausts on this continent of the indigenous people, of people in Mexico, which used to be California, Texas, and I can keep going with that. That is part of our lived reality that we're still grappling with, putting children in cages. So not understanding the historical perspective makes us think that this is an anomaly, but it's not an anomaly. I suggest reading Ronald Takaki's A Different Mirror to begin to unsee some of the unseen stuff that you don't want to see, because the only person it serves is those who are uncomfortable and who don't want to be uncomfortable. Where people of African, Asian, Latino, etc. are constantly uncomfortable because they're suffering and having to deal with the experiences of institutional individual racism and all the other isms.
Thank you. And I'll transition from there again. Ada, you mentioned this notion of comfort, and it makes us focus on who is to be comforted, who is not, and what happens when certain people feel discomfort and what that means. So that connects to this next question, which is question 4. And it speaks about our positioning and how Black women are made to feel uncomfortable. How do white people's imposed and outsider positionings of you based on your race and gender shape what is expected of you in the academy? And I'll ask it again. How do white people's imposed and outsider positionings of you based on your race and gender shape what is expected of you in the academy? And we will hear from Adrian first. And Nicole, I have a question for you as well.
And I think when I start talking about this, again, images related to motherhood come up. Because so much of Black women's narrative has been shaped around motherhood. And one of the things that comes up is the mammy expectation, that I am here to coddle and hold and soothe and make you feel better. And if you're uncomfortable, then I'm here to jump to your rescue. Essentially, any need that I might have, any goal, anything about my experience gets minimized in order to privilege the experiences of whiteness. And I think too, another thing that I've experienced is related to the superwoman trope, that I can handle it all. Doesn't matter what it is, just You got it. You got it. You got it. Well, oh, Adrian's got it. Adrian can do it. Adrian can do it. Okay. And I was in the position for a while of just doing that. Let me be as much to all of my students. Let me be as much to my colleagues, because they're looking at my stuff differently than they might be at another colleague's based on our racial gender experience. And I'm trying to contort and twist my body, twist my time, twist everything so I can do that while still providing the kind of, again, similar mothering dynamic with a lot of Black students who have additional questions. Well, what about my side? I don't know how comfortable they'll be. How is it every year I have the same conversation? It's a private conversation. I never invite it, but it always happens. Is some student will knock on my door and say, I'm a little bit concerned about going into a site placement. And I want to tell them, well, don't worry about it, except that I can't, because we got to deal with these things honestly and openly. But it happens every year. So I can do everything I can. I can take all my time, take all my energy. I can do that. And I have. But at what cost? And that's the thing that has shifted for me recently, is at what cost? I have started to protect my energy. And I say it now all the time. It is my new catchphrase, to protect my energy. Because whether I am loud, whether I am quiet, if I am present, if I'm absent, I stand out. I'm over visible because I physically am different. But at the same time, my voice can be invisible. And that dichotomy, again, I go back to, what am I supposed to do? What do you want from me? And the answer that I would say, this is again my perspective, the answer is everything. And that's not something I'm willing to give. Because this academic space, this is a role, this is a job, this is not my whole identity. The people, the issues, the topics, the stories that are about me, that are about my issues, my people, my focus, my voice, that's where I'm putting my energy. So pulling back and just saying, no, here's my concern. Y'all do whatever you want to do. And that has been a total shift for me. I have never really done that before, but it's because I have to protect my energy, because, and I say this, and this always sounds really horrible every time I say it, because what if I give my all to this, and then whether it be that I die, I leave, anything happens, there will, regardless of what happens, be a search committee convened. So I am replaceable. Me, myself, my core, my identity, that you can't have. I will do my job to the very best of my ability, and I will mess up frequently, but I'll own my mistakes and keep moving forward. Because at the end of the day, my voice, myself, has more value to me, even if it doesn't have value in this space. And so again, I'm going to bring it back to that girlhood. That little girl that was told all the time that you have something to say, you go for it, girl. You better go out there, little girl. That's what I'm hanging on to. I'm not hanging on to the noise around me, because all that is just white noise. Literal white noise.
Adrian, thank you. There's so much. And so first I want to acknowledge that there's so much that you just shared that we are going to come back to. So I'm just going to temporarily, we'll transition and we're going to come back to, because what you just said connects to so many of the questions that everyone who is engaging with us in our audience has asked, that you poignantly already started to talk about. So we'll come back to many of the things that you shared. In continuing what you honestly and powerfully just shared, Adrian, about your positionality, I have a related question for Nicole. And Nicole, I want us to think about racism in the academy and at institutions, and how there's a notion often that if we just have diversity hires, that this dismantles racism. So Nicole, I would like to know your thoughts on, do diversity hires assist in dismantling racism?
Wow. Okay. So we definitely have some amazing scholars on the line who researched this racism, right? I'm going to tell you from a personal view, perspective of dismantling racism as a diverse hire? So thank you for that question. The short answer is no. However, let me put some context around that. All right. To dismantle, right, you have to deconstruct, you have to tear apart, right? So to dismantle, one needs to be able to analyze that object, right? They need to understand all the pieces that make that object and how it operates, whether it's functioning or not functioning, correct? So as a diverse hire, I checked all the boxes, right? So let's imagine a checklist. Black, check. Female, check. Advanced degree, check. References, check. Experience, check. I checked all the boxes on the checklist. But once all those boxes are checked, that means that the person meets all the criteria on the checklist for reporting purposes, right? It's all for reporting purposes. It's an open and shut case at that point. One can say as a diverse hire is mutually beneficial, meaning that it's beneficial to the employer and the employee, but it really favors the employer only. As a diverse hire, yes, we do get an income, but let's talk about what we get beyond that, okay? So we imagine the checklist, right? Now go ahead and imagine a seesaw. So remember when we were kids and the little seesaw, right? So when you're a diverse hire, the seesaw is balanced when you first get on. Once the employer checks the diversity hire box, this person meets all the criteria. And you get your income, it seems balanced when we're first on a seesaw, right? But what happens is when that case is shut, the seesaw tilts. And it tilts in favor of the employer, not the employee, as a diverse hire. That diverse hire is literally and figuratively fed breadcrumbs and expected to make a meal out of it. That's what we're expected to do. Because that seesaw is tilted. The diverse hire, yeah, we receive an income, but the employer receives all the benefits. Reporting, the PR perspective they get, and we're just often left to care for ourselves, to figure out how are we going to do this with breadcrumbs. So I think back on that poem that I read earlier, in scraps instead of the best portion. I used to thought when I wrote it, I was talking about literally you go to a restaurant and you know you've been mistreated because you're giving the last portion, the scraps. Slaves were given the scraps as well, right? So yeah, we receive this income and all that, and we have to defend for self. I'm in my 4th year at the university here, and I've never been asked one question to help me move the needle forward as a diverse hire, not one question. Now, I do have people saying the typical soundbite, hey, let me know if you need anything. I'm here if you need me. That's not analysis. That's not deconstructing. That's not understanding. That's not being able to tear apart and put it back together again. That's not doing that. So how can you deconstruct if you haven't even analyzed it? How can you deconstruct if you haven't even asked me one question to help me? The seesaw is tilted in the favor of the employer, not the employee. So, and if I don't know the right questions to even ask, once again, I have breadcrumbs and I have to make a meal out of these breadcrumbs. So I'm left with, yes, the benefit of having an income, but I have no support system. So my answer is no. Diverse hires, we don't dismantle racism. It exposes racism to the diverse hire in unexpected ways. That's my answer.
Thank you, Nicole. And Adrian and Nicole, there are powerful points that you both made that we will come back to in the next spinoff question as well. Before we transition to the spinoff question.
Could I make one comment?
Yes.
Just following up with what Nicole just said. Yeah, she checked all the boxes. The university can say we've got this many people, hired to do this, that, and the other. But what really counts, and what I heard her saying, is the values of those who hired you. What is it that you really want to accomplish? And that's just not at the dean level. That's at the board level. That's at the administration and the board level. So what are our values about these diverse hires? What do we want the result to be? And are we willing to hold people accountable for making sure that that kind of change happens? Otherwise, it's just what Nicole said. The boxes get checked and everything stays the same.
Mm-hmm. Jean,
and I like
you just made a very powerful point about accountability and distinguishing between true change and just surface level change. So yes. This connects to a question that I have for both you and Ada. And the question is, so Adrian and Nicole helped us to think about how policies that are intended to work toward anti-racism really don't. And how, as professors and educators, we have particular situations with students that we have to brave through, possibly year after year, when being questioned about our positionality or our Black students' positionality. So I want to ask a question that connects to our values and accountability and what we say and the words that we say. So I'll give an example. Sometimes we hear statements from our white colleagues that say, I'm not racist, I'm a good person. I'm not racist, I have a Black friend. I'm not racist, I ask my Black colleague to partner in particular efforts. There's also a comment that is often made that, we can hear where the statement is, I don't see color. I'm not racist, I don't see color. I would like to know, Jean and Ada, your thoughts on these statements.
When you don't see color, you don't see me. You just don't see me, because I can't, even though race is a social construct and there, could be a whole conversation about that. The reality is that connected to race is culture and who I am and how I've been reared and what my experiences are and all of those kinds of things. So when you're saying that you don't see race, you're saying that you look at me and you just see yourself. You see your own experiences. You see what you think the world ought to be, as opposed to what the world is and what I have come through and what I am living with. And you're also saying you're not interested. You're not only saying you don't see it, but you're not even interested in raising the question with me. And so when you, like one of the examples that you gave, Theda, when you ask me to partner with you, you're asking me to partner with you on a project. You're really not bringing me in because you don't see color. You're not bringing me in to share from my perspective for real. You may have said it on the surface, but maybe that's not really where you are.
There's a wonderful book called Seeing Race Again, Countering Color Blindness Across the Disciplines. And what it speaks to this whole idea of color blindness. But you do see me. And sometimes I'm hyper visible. At other times I'm visible, as Nicole was saying, once I'm hired, and then I'm invisible in terms of how you want me to actually be in the system itself. So when we think about when people say, I don't see color, but you're really saying, Jean's right, you want me to be like you. Well, I can't be like you. I'm only be myself, which is an African American woman rooted in that tradition, raised in that tradition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what does that mean for us coming into the academy or Fortune 500 company or school system? It means that you have to give me all of who I am and not try to make me into you so you can be comfortable with the fit. That's a word often used a lot. Oh, you don't fit. So I've had people, because I'm a white Black girl, say, oh, why don't you wear your hair straight? Oh, why don't you, dress this way? I mean, I literally have had people say things to me for me to appear more white than I can appear because I have African features, of course. And so you see me, but you don't want to see me. You want me to be a reflection of you. You want me to do all the things that you want me to do. But when I ask you to dismantle these systems of oppression in a meeting, when I talk about it and you shut me down or silence me, it just speaks to the idea that who does racism serve? If racism is white privilege plus power, then how do people who have the power want to give it up? And that's the constant struggle, is that people who have it, it works for them. So that's leading back to that question you asked earlier about, when people say, well, why don't we just ignore? Because who does the system work for? And so one of the things that Angela Davis said is that you have to create a new table. You have to abolish and create something new. Reforms never work. So you bring me in as a reform, but you've changed nothing about the system. Your focus is on me and not on the system. So that's what has to be changed to me, because I'm going to be all Black, because that's what I am. I can't be anything other than that.
Ada, thank you. And that leads very nicely into the next question. So we're talking about truly dismantling racism. And this is a question from our audience, and thank you for this question. What would it look like to work for a truly anti-racist institution? How might that affect your personal and professional experience as a Black woman? And we will start with Adrian. So I'll ask again, what would it look like to work for a truly anti-racist institution? How might that affect your personal and professional experience as a Black woman? And we'll start with Adrian.
So one of the things that I thought of immediately were practices and policies, because we all have lots of policies, lots of things that are written down. What I find, though, is that how those policies get implemented, with whom those policies get implemented, and who gets to decide which policies are implemented in what ways, that tends to be where I see a lot of problems, because it's not even necessarily just, okay, it benefits Black students, white students. It's not even that. It's who gets to decide how we implement policy. And what I find interesting is that individuals, and not just, and I think it's important to note this, not just white individuals, but also non-Black people of color, also sometimes Black men, their voices are valued more than ours. And it's this hierarchy that is so unnecessary. Because if this is our policy, well, then let's look at the policy, let's look at the practice and say, okay, why would we be doing something different in this case? What would be the rationale for that? And quite frequently, no one can really answer that question other than, I want to help the student. Well, we all want to help students. But if our policies aren't working, then let's look at our policies. Let's look at our policies. Or are we just going to do it for the students that we want when we want to, because we want to? And you have the power to do that. That, I think, is a part of the problem that I see. One of the other things I see, and this goes to what Ada was speaking about, is that idea of fit. When we talk about how someone fits, and I see the similar way that the word collegial gets used around here, and I don't just say this institution, but I think at all institutions, the word collegial means happy, perky, good morning, cupcakes, are you bringing cupcakes today? Or whatever sort of pleasant image is created, versus just good morning, can we do our work? And if you're not all about trying to focus on individuals and then somehow you're not collegial, you don't care, any number of things. I would also say when we start thinking about what are the things that we are reading, what are the things that we're asking about, to me, one of the best things that has been a benefit at Ohio University has been honestly through the library and the alternative textbooks. One of the things that I've found that has been amazing for my classes has been to pull in different writers. I don't believe in the one textbook approach to anything. You've got to have multiple people, multiple speakers talking about these same issues because they're able to really speak to issues of voice, issues of power, issues of privilege on these different things. I think, and clearly I got a long list. There are many things that need to be happening. But I think also taking into account that we need to be asking important questions of how is racism operating here? And I'm pulling this question from Dr. Kamara Phyllis-Jones. And I think that when we ask that question at every level, every moment, every meeting, anything, that's our question. We have to start there of how is racism operating here? How is sexism operating here? Are we being as vigilant? Are we giving or not giving the benefit of the doubt to white colleagues in the same way? So if you're asking what would be fair, then I would say put the same amount of scrutiny on everybody that you put on me. The same lack of the benefit of the doubt, put that on everybody. If that's what we want to do to really hold this line of making the institution more fair, more equitable, more honest, then let's do that across the board. And not just when we feel like it or with somebody who looks like us or with somebody who is more comfortable, more palatable. Let's really take a look at policies and ask ourselves hard questions at every level, every interaction. And I think we've discussed this, and I'm sure this will come up as well. This idea that when it comes to resources, I tend to struggle with that sometimes because truthfully, I tell my multicultural class this all the time. I'm not giving you anything that hasn't been said for hundreds of years. I don't have anything magical or special or new. People have been having these same conversations, these same discussions, the same writings, the same problems for years. And so you want to ask for the newest book, the one with the 2020 date in it. You can look back to something from the 1900s, from the 1800s. You can hear a speech. There is so much out there that I don't know what else to give you other than say, just jump in and read some stuff. Find a syllabus online. Like people are working so hard to create resources and it's spoon feeding. But the onus is on you. If you want to make things different and better, then engage in your own work. And we all have different areas of positionality that we come into this. Anti-Black racism is definitely a thing with white people, with non-Black people of color. We all have important discussions. And one of the things that I love about Dr. Annalise Singh is how open and honest she is in talking about anti-Black racism that she learned as a biracial white and Southeast Asian person. And I'm like, thank you. Can we just talk about it? And that honesty, I think, is a part of what's missing. So there are so many books, there's so many things that are there. You have to take responsibility. In the same way that I have to take responsibility for my privilege in another area, I need white people to take responsibility for their privilege. I need white women to acknowledge the racialized gender experience as a white woman in education. Let's talk about that very honestly and very directly. And that was a very, very long answer. But I know that other folks have things to say as well. But thank you, Thea.
Thank you, Adrian. So I'll transition, and Ada, I'll ask a spinoff question, and if anyone else wants to answer this as well. There's something that I want to recap too, and I don't want to minimize because Adrian, what you said was very powerful, and there was so much that I hope that our listeners were writing down. But one of the powerful things that you said, instead of giving a list of resources, and the resources can be helpful, put in context, as you just said, but you said what we can each do is ask in every situation, in every classroom, in every school system, in every institution, how is racism operating here? Not by starting off and asking, is it, but saying how? How is it operating here? and what are the next steps so that we immediately respond to it, as opposed to dragging our feet and coming up with a plan and just talking. But we come to the table and we say, with Black women at the table, with a diverse table of people, and say, how is racism operating here, as opposed to is it, or denying that it exists, which is really important. So thank you. The next question is also a spinoff from our audience. And Ada, I'm going to direct this question to you, and then I'll follow up with questions specific for Nicole and Jean. Okay. So Ada, this question is, as a white woman, how can I better honor the stories of Black women and Black people? What is my role in making sure Black voices are truly heard?
I just want to tap into something you said before, though, that Adrian was saying, is that first of all, I think you have to recognize that racism does exist, that all ism exists. But I think as a white woman, you know, whites are colored in Crayola box too. Start with yourself. So it's not so much about, you can't be an ally to me if you do not understand your own positionality and how you benefit as a white woman, and all the positionalities you can have within that. You can't, because that's a blind side for me. And then I'm questioning whether or not you're really my colleague, really my friend, if you're not doing your own work, as Bell Hooks talks about. So I think the answer is not for you to worry about how you're going to connect with me, but to worry about how you're going to connect with yourself. And how are you going to, you know, disentangle for yourself all the ways you have benefited as a white woman going through the process, particularly if you're an educator. When no one's ever questioned you about anything, you come into a room, people say hello, you know, question yourself and how you have benefited. And Peggy McIntosh always says, it's invisible knapsack. It is not invisible. It is extremely visible. It is hyper visible, actually, at some times. So study yourself, question yourself with some of the questions that Adrian offered. You know, what are you doing to do your work for yourself?
Thank you, Ada. And offering additional questions that we can ask is very important too. And I want to direct the next question to Nicole. Nicole, as you think about your field and the broader field as well, what advice can you give to your current students in terms of what they can do to dismantle racism and to go out into their specific fields and to also engage in anti-racism through their work?
Well, okay, so we do know that the majority of my students are, you know, they don't look like me, right? With that being said, there are a few students. I always get a handful of Black students in my class. So for the non-Black students, in order to really move forward, because we know they're going to be in the workforce, right? And it all starts, hate breeds hate. Love breeds love, right? Love is an action. Anti-racism is an action as well. So for students who really want to be against racism, they have to start now, and they have to start in the classroom. So when we start thinking about, you know, some of the stuff I said in that poem, my voice is silenced, you know, rejections and all of that. It starts early, right? And then if you could take that into your assignments, when you're working on team assignments, and letting everyone's voice be heard. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to agree with someone, but let the person be heard. So one of the things that I like to think about is a measuring stick. The same, so here's a ruler, right? We all want to be, at the end of the day, be measured by the same measuring stick. But unfortunately, it's exhausting. Racism is exhausting. Living through racism is exhausting. And I still have to fight where I have to be the whole head and shoulders above, where I'm reviewing stuff from my colleagues because they're measured on a different, you know, stick than I am. And I don't think it's fair. It's not fair and equitable. But if it starts earlier, if it starts when K through 12, to be honest, but if we get them at least in college, start on your team assignments, letting people's voice be heard. Don't shoot down people's questions, their concerns, because right now, I get shot down all the time. My voice, nope, next. So let it start early and don't let it get to someone when you turn 50 years old and you unpack or try to unpack all that's inside you.
Thank you, Nicole. And in the 2 minutes that we have left, so while we may not all be able to answer this question, I want to acknowledge how important this question is. So to the audience, letting you know that we've talked about the trauma and the pain, and there were metaphors about scraps that we have to deal with, is that what we are talking about is we have the women on this call have bared their soul in many ways in a space that is safe for them. We also want to talk about is our joy, is that we have joy, and there are ways that our community members and our families come through for us. So Jean, my question is, how do you stay positive and cope with racism as a Black woman? And what are the ways that your friends, your colleagues, and family affirm you and connect you to joy and remind you of your importance?
You know, one of the most joyous things I've done recently is to participate on this panel with these amazing women. And that leads me into my response, and that is, we all need to make sure that our lives and our presence on this earth has meant something, whether we're Black, white, Latino, whatever we are, that it has meant something, and that that we have impacted the lives of someone else. And if calling out racism is important to us, then that means we do it. We do it, we continue to do it, and we're unafraid to do it. And that we mentor other individuals. One of the things that gives me joy is that I have had the privilege to be in contact with thousands of students in K-12. And when they come back and say to me that my presence in their lives has meant something, it changed, it helped them to think about something differently, then that gives me joy. That makes me happy. And it means that my presence has actually meant something on this earth. And I think that all of us need to think about, what is our presence doing? Are we degrading someone? Are we demeaning someone? Are we making someone else's life more difficult? Or are we lifting up and empowering others?
Thank you so much, Jean. And as we wrap up, I first want to say thank you to each of you again. Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Ada. Thank you, Nicole, for your honesty in this space today. For our attendees and our participants, thank you for your questions. We want to remind you again about the evaluation that we have provided in the chat. Please do take a few minutes after the session ends to complete the evaluation, as your thoughts are very valuable to us. We also want to remind you about our next Munch and Learn session, which will be from 12 to 1:30 p.m. on November 9th. Again, that will be from 12 to 1:30 p.m. on November 9th, where we will discuss the misrepresentation of people of color in research. So again, I want to thank you each and thank our audience members. We appreciate each of you. We appreciate your thoughts. We appreciate you bearing your soul. And we ask that as each of you transition from here today, that you honor what has been shared today, that you take some time to reflect, to think on your own, and to talk with your colleagues about action steps that you can take on your own moving forward, that you can research many of the resources, much of the curriculum that exists many of the books that were listed here, and please do feel free to follow up with each one of us if you have additional questions that we may not have had the opportunity to ask. Dean Middleton, thank you again for creating this space, as we know that these spaces are not always created in every college of education. So we appreciate that this space exists, and it exists because of you. Dr. Mona Robinson, thank you again for convening us and allowing us to come up with questions on our own terms that were not imposed and did not come from outside. Thank you each for today. May you all be well.